Donc, je suis obligée de parler français.
So I'm going to have to speak French, and first of all, allow me to introduce myself very quickly as chair of Hadopi. I'm a magistrate, I'm an advisor to the Cour de Cassation, and in fact, for 40 years, I was working on copyright, which is how come I became president of Hadopi, and for the end of my career, it's something that's pretty busy. So why Hadopi? Well, we began by realizing that the pirating of works had become a national sport in France, and not only in France, and we needed to do something. Generally, people do respect the law, but they had regularly, in fact, taken stolen works without really realizing it and without realizing of the consequences that it could have. So what could we do? Well, the legislation on falsification is 3 years of imprisonment and 300,000 euros fine. So it seemed to be really inefficient, and in fact, we were not able to apply it because magistrates didn't generally follow it and were not going to imprison people. So we decided that we should create a higher authority, an independent higher authority, which we called Hadopi, so the higher authority for the diffusion of works and the protection of rights on the internet. And this higher authority is independent. I'd really like to underline that. It is an independent because, after all, if our budget is given to us by the Ministry for Culture, we have absolutely no orders to take, and we don't work under any auspices. So we don't work under any auspices morally or intellectually. So the independence, we have two bodies. On one side, you have what's called the Commission, which protects rights, which in fact puts into response the graduated response, and I'll come back to it bit by bit and tell you what results we've obtained. And then, on the other hand, you've got a kind of group which is to encourage the development of the legal offer, to also observe the licit and illicit use on internet, and also to look how they're developing. And we also have the possibility to be able to put forward modifications if we actually see that the modifications are necessary. And then, of course, we've got a number of other missions, such as, in fact, interoperability, and also to ensure that exceptions are taken into consideration as far as copyright. So that's our mission. So let's come back to this graduated response. So what this means, first of all, is that Adobe does not supervise or survey the internet. And a number of times I've been called by saying that I was supervising the internet and that I was a real police officer. No. In fact, those who've got right are going to contact Adobe when they've realized that, in fact, there's illicit use on the internet and illicit usage in the peer-to-peer networks, because after all, the Commission, in fact, is only interested in looking at the peer-to-peer regime, and we do not pursue, we don't follow up the downloading as is. However, we are responsible of what we call negligence, a certain characterized negligence. What does that mean? Well, it's very simple. The holder of internet access has got a certain responsibility, to make sure that the access is not used for illicit ends, because, of course, you must realize that I, myself, would never download illicitly, but at the same time, I don't know what my kids would do, nor my husband. And so, therefore, then I would be responsible. So, for example, if my kids were going to be downloading. So you can see we're very limited. Peer-to-peer and characterized negligence. So what happens? So we have, in fact, first of all, we look at those who have got the right. Then we have an IP address. We also have the date and the time and the nature of the work with a small extract of the illicit work that, in fact, had an exchange on the peer-to-peer network illicitly. And then from that particular IP address, Hadopi is going to ask to the access supplier to identify the person who actually is behind that address. And then the access supplier will actually give the information to Adobe, and then we'll send a recommendation. So that's the first recommendation that's done by email, where we indicate to the holder of access, look, your access was in fact to be used for illicit ends, and we'd just like to tell you that intellectual property, in fact, is important. So we try to educate people. We try to make them feel responsible, to tell them, look, that there are legal offers and that they should do that. And then if they persist, then we'll tell them, well, maybe it could get to the judge. And if in the 6 following months the same person has committed the same crime in a way, then we'll do the same thing. But then the email will be tougher, because in fact there will always be sent by a recommended letter to make sure that the person was contacted. And so then we'll begin again trying to educate these people, and generally we succeed. But then there's a third stage, and the third stage is much tougher, because there we will notify the person, and notify the person who once again has committed this act in the following year after the second recommendation or notification, in where then we'll tell them, well, look, now we could send this matter to the judge, and it's the judge who will actually decide on a fine, 1,500 euros fine, and even accompany that with a possible suspension of internet access for a month. And then we actually invite the person to actually make comments, to respond. So let's talk a bit about figures, because after all, you've got to see what kind of effect this had. And you can actually see that with this kind of graduated response, essentially what we want to do is to educate people, make people realize, that the user realize that he's responsible. So here are the figures. So 970,000 first recommendations were already sent. Those figures are those of February or March, and then afterwards 88,600 second recommendations, and then we got to the third stage, 270 notification letters at the first stage. And I'd like to say that each stage, Hadopi, in fact, sort of accompanies the people who actually make contact with them and who want to understand why. So most of the time, I'll just tell you a funny story. Most of those who want to know the works that were, in fact, noted on the internet, the illegal works. And just to make you smile, the first one that actually we got hold of said to us, well, look, I was coming home from work. I saw Hadopi. I didn't open up the letter. I just opened it the next day. And my goodness, I had downloaded for 24 hours non-stop. I did something illegal. I promise you I will never do this again, and please forgive me. Please, can I download the last episode of 24 Hours, because I want to know what happened at the end. So, in fact, you can see straight away that the user actually needs to be really, really well educated. But, in fact, that should have made you smile or laugh. But we realized that, in fact, most of the time, people who were sort of picked out, who are they? They're people who, in fact, haven't protected their Wi-Fi because they didn't know how to protect their Wi-Fi. And the Hadopi representatives accompany them and try to make sure that they can protect their Wi-Fi by just asking for the necessary web key to their supplier. And then that can allow them, of course, to obtain results. Or else, quite often, because after we're talking about peer-to-peer as well, possibly will have installed a software. They will have installed a software. They've left that software on their computer. And every time that they connect onto the internet, well, then the software, of course, will start working again, and then that will mean that what was downloaded 15 days beforehand will once again be offered on the internet, and then could lead to a problem. And so we explained to them how they can actually get rid of the software that they had actually installed with illicit aims. So we have had a few responses. So don't make me say what I don't say. We noticed, in fact, through our various studies, that 94% of those people who have actually received a first notice or first recommendation we haven't had to send them a second warning, as it were. I haven't said that, in fact, they hadn't carried out any illicit usage, but I'm just saying that they were not sent a second warning. 92% of people, in fact, who had received a second warning did not, in fact, have a third warning, did not get to the third stage. And those that got to the third stage, 98% of those people, in fact, who he'd warned or he'd notified, 98% of those, in fact, did not recommit this error. And we realized that, in fact, when they're in the third stage, 71% of the people, in fact, made contact with Hadopi when they got to the third stage by saying, but look, I just don't understand how I got to the third stage. Please explain what's going on. And it's that particular, the way we accompany them, systematically we accompany them, and then we can actually ensure that illegal usage in peer-to-peer is going down. And the studies that were carried out as well, I just want to talk about the Nielsen studies in particular. They demonstrated that the sites offering links or ways of using peer-to-peer in an illegal fashion had gone down by 17%. And Mediometry or net ratings, particularly looking, in fact, at the four main ones, in other words, Emule, BitTorrent, BBTorrent, and I can't remember the other one. Wirefile, I think possibly, says the speaker. Well, they lost 29%, so that shows that, in fact, the peer-to-peer is going down. At the same time, we also realize, and that's a peer media technology study, we realize that 43% or less illegal data was actually shared in illegal fashion on the various sites. So peer media technologies, in fact, target about 200 to 300 works. And ALPA, which is an association to fight against audiovisual piracy, ALPA just looks at the top 10 and, in fact, encountered a reduction of illegal data sharing on peer-to-peer networks, a reduction of 66%. So, therefore, we can certainly say that, in fact, the peer-to-peer is going down, and we also realize that it has gone down more in France than in other countries. However, we also asked ourselves, and this is a question that we're always asked, well, you say, well, it's all hunky-dory having the peer-to-peer, but also you've still got a lot of usage through streaming or direct downloading and mega upload and so on. And so what we can respond with certainty, because I don't want to say what's not true, obviously, what we can say is that it hasn't been demonstrated to us up until now that, in fact, this was a particular, in fact, they had gone on to the other areas. But that's all I can say. But what I can say is that at the same time as this kind of thing, what's sure is that Hadopi is not only involved or not only interested in peer-to-peer, which after all comes from the Commission of Protection of Rights, but I also asked the chair of the Commission to look at streaming in particular and direct downloads and to see what would be possible to do in that particular area. The study is underway. I'm very sorry because, in fact, I had hoped to be able to give you a report, but in fact, the report will just be submitted in the coming weeks and will, in fact, be a public report very quickly. But as far as streaming is concerned and direct downloads, we're looking at those areas very closely because, after all, we're not only talking about peer-to-peer, even though peer-to-peer still for us is still particularly important. So apart from that, what can we say? Well, apart from that, we have to be able to look at the kind of legal offer. And that's really our responsibility. And in order to, in fact, offer legitimate offers, we realize that people don't have a certain visibility. Our target are not the pirates, the sort of obsessive pirates who want at all costs to succeed. I think that that's not Hadopi's responsibility. We want to be able to look at the majority of Internet users, myself, my husband, everybody here, who don't know the net that well and often don't know where they find themselves and sometimes are really unaware of the real scope of their acts. And this particular population needs to be educated, and the French legislators asked us to be able to have a kind of label, so we've called it PURE, Promotion of Responsible Uses. You can think what you like. Promotion of responsible use, and currently we have about 50 platforms that have asked for this label, and in fact PUR.fr, which means that for those who don't know the net that well and who want to be legal on it, to find their way. And we realize that on those particular platforms, not only do we all have all the various methods of consumption, whether we're talking about free or paying or rental or streaming or direct downloads. But at the same time, we have a majority area, which of course is music. 60% is music, but we're also looking at videos, video games, photography, and we've even added recently digital books. Digital books have joined that particular platform. So what can we say? Well, we realize, nevertheless, still in the studies that have been carried out, that there's a certain stabilization of the consumption, and that the legal offer, as it were, in fact, does have a possibility to be developed. I believe, and this is something I'm actually convinced of from the start, as the chair of Hadopi says as well, we are not only, in fact, looking at those who have the right, but at the same time, we want to be able to protect, in fact, the owners of the rights, and also the internet users. And I think that this aspect will, in fact, develop more and more. It's true that, in fact, we talked about it earlier on. Music has actually succeeded its business model. Its business model works pretty well. I mean, Spotify, we can ask ourselves questions, how does it work and why is it working? However, we realize that there are some free sites, in fact, that have a certain amount of importance. Free, well, nothing's ever free. There's always advertising. I mean, that's implicit, of course. And then there are some others that, in fact, play another card. And I believe that that's a card that possibly should be playing, which is that of quality. There's a site in France which is called Co-Bars, which really plays on quality. Because, for example, you've got subscriptions for €7, then there are some for €13 that are slightly better. And then for those who are really sort of rather obsessive, because they, in fact, have classical jazz and classical music in particular. And you know that for classical music, you need to have quality, and in order to have quality, of course, you have some subscriptions that are far more expensive or purchases that cost you more but will give you quality. But you can see that there's a various possibility of developing various models, and that's what we encourage, and that's what we try to encourage as far as possible. As far as films are possible, of course, the film is far more difficult because, of course, the media in France allows one to finance French film. Why? Because, of course, we want to have a certain diversity, and therefore the problem is slightly thornier. At the time, we carried out a study which showed that internet users felt that legal sites weren't sufficiently easy to have access, that the catalogs were not open, and that the prices were really too high, and also that there was this kind of that often you had to wait for a very long time before being able to have legal access to a new film. And all that, as far as I'm concerned, of course, is now in the past, because I think a lot of effort still has to be made. However, I believe that, in fact, the films have got to become attractive, and competition. I don't like the use of the word competition, but give competition to the illicit sites. And I think that one day we'll be able to succeed. Hadopi has got another aspect to it as well, because it's a kind of an institution that allows for certain observations and studies to be made. We've created, and this is a first in France and something that wasn't easy, we created what we call the laboratories that actually work in a collaborative fashion and in creativity, which for an French administrative body is really something that's really quite exceptional. But at the same time, each and every one can actually come and work in our laboratories. We actually encourage people to do so, and the Collège has also got some works on open data, exceptions, usage, and the basket, as it were, the basket of internet users as far as content is concerned. And so there's a kind of whole panoply of possibilities, and I think that these laboratories are something that really is quite new, but it's something that's very important as well and will give an opportunity. So Hadopi possibly is already part of prehistory far a bit more today than yesterday. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I don't know what its future will be. However, what I can tell you is, as far as I'm concerned, I'm independent, and I don't actually when I'm talking about I mean the institution doesn't depend on politics. However, I'm really strongly convinced that our institution will remain, possibly under another form. It'll have to develop. There's no perfect law. It's got to be able to develop. But we do realize, nevertheless, that the first results that have been obtained through Adobe for considerable efforts, because after all, we were talking about an area that was particularly conflicted. Well, in fact, we at least have the merit of having tried to do something on the ground, and we realize that if we attack from all sides, then long term we'll actually be able to reduce this kind of behavior, this kind of illicit behavior. Rome wasn't built in a day. Adobe will not be built in 2 years.
If you don't mind, but it's okay. Moment, just hold on. But Bertrand has a question for our speaker, and you'll hear it translated on your headphones.
Madame Marais, d'abord, bonjour et un grand merci à vous de vous être.
Good morning, and thank you very much for coming to us. I'd just like to thank you on behalf of all the members of the coalition. Very recently, I went back to France to visit my family, and I realized that, in fact, this question of copyright, in fact, was dealt with in family rows. So we talked about it. Yes, I can confirm that as well. We've had rows in my family about it, and that's a really good consciousness raising. And now the very quick question. You've kind of opened up this field when you talked about peer-to-peer, telling us that we're very worried about peer-to-pay, the drag, download, and streaming, and you, in fact, have got a certain responsibility. So what's your timetable? When you've got to submit the report, and what measures are you hoping for? Well, as far as the timetable is concerned, I can just say that Mireille Abercarita, who is in fact the president or the chair of this research, and in fact there have been a number of meetings, and IDAT in fact also carried out a study which you can see on our site, and the IDAT study describes a kind of ecosystem of streaming and direct download. Mireille Abercarita, in fact, also told us that she was going to, this is a stage, because after all, she has to carry on with this job. Within the next 15 days, she's going to give us her report, and she'll give the data to the college, because after all, we'll be discussing it afterwards. And she hopes to be able to finalize her report towards the end of June or July. As far as the various paths to be taken, I can't obviously unveil or tell you precisely what we're going to be doing. Nevertheless, I have heard say that people are sort of saying, well, couldn't we try to stop the people who are financing these illicit sites? But of course, that's a major question mark, because one site is not necessarily always illicit, and it's very difficult to distinguish whether it's illicit or not. If this problem was simple, we would have found a solution a jolly long time ago. And if the problem had been simple, then 15 years ago, the judge would have sort of given a gradual riposte, 3 months firm, 6 months firm, 1 year firm. But it's far more complex than that, far more complicated, and I believe that we also have to look at people's mentalities. And I think that the mentalities or the behavior, we're not only talking about internet users, but we're also talking about those people who supply access, or those, in fact, who could actually have new economic models and not necessarily transfer their material habits into the immaterial world. I'd just like to come back rapidly to, because I didn't read in detail, the book by Michel Serres. His book said that in reality, what we're living through on internet, we're wondering if it's almost a revolution. But in reality, it's possibly a change of civilization, and to anticipate precisely what could actually happen and to try to really be competitive, but at the same time give a certain value. As a magistrate, I hate talking about being competitive to those who are actually stealing, but in the end, I feel that I'm a consumer as well. I mean, I am the chair of Hadopi, but I always say I'm Mrs. Cyber. Mrs. Cyber. I buy books, industrial quantities of books, but of course, when you can easily do it, I mean, it's a wonderful way to do so. But for example, I've just bought the sixth Kindle. It's impossible. I've been spending 3 days to try to connect myself. Nightmare. So, I mean, of course, for books, you don't have illicit sites. But I know that the basic user, when he doesn't understand why you shouldn't actually steal, and when he has to actually spend 3 hours to get hold of one film, and in the middle of the film it's going to stop and it breaks down, you say, got to start again because you've got a bug, and then he saw a code that's as long as his arm. I can see that it's difficult for them to understand, but at the same time, I'm absolutely convinced that with our strength and with our strength of conviction, one day we'll be able to get people to understand, because they've got to understand that, in fact, when they're stealing, they'll have no more works at all, and they won't be able to steal anything in the end. So, of course, I'm exaggerating a bit, and I'm being a bit simplistic in what I'm telling you, but I really do feel what each and every one should, in fact, feel viscerally. Thank you very much.
Thank you.